good. Welcome.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that very warm welcome. And yes, I am from Richmond, Virginia, so I'm always so happy to be in the company of anyone from the Martin Agency. And speaking of Richmond, Virginia, I don't think my presentation is up, but I'm going to show you. I'm going to start. Oh, nope. Go back one. I'm going to start with a picture that was taken in Richmond, Virginia. That is a picture of me. That picture was actually taken almost 40 years, a little more than 40 years ago, minutes before my third birthday party began. You get that if you actually can make out the bag there. That's my mom's bag of goodie bags, and I'm holding a pinwheel. And it's a simple picture because birthday parties 40 years ago were a pretty simple thing. They were about cake and candles and presents and friends and family. And this is on my mind this morning because yesterday was actually my 3-year-old son's birthday. And 40 years later, I can tell you that the expectations around what a mom has to do for a birthday party, particularly if she lives in New York City, have changed pretty dramatically from what my mom was thinking about. So, you know, when my mom thought about food for a birthday party, she was thinking about a grocery store sheet cake, and now there are caterers, and where there were streamers and banners from the party store, now there are life-size trains. And where the main activity at a birthday party when I was 3 years old was probably opening a handful of very small presents. My son and I were recently at a birthday party where the main activity was this, which nearly pushed me over the edge. So we could spend the next 20 minutes debating the merits of this. My guess is you'll come out in the same place that I am, but I think the basic point I want to make should feed the rest of our conversation, and that is that expectations for engagement, in this case around birthday parties, but in general, don't stand still. Expectations for engagement don't stand still. And I would say that in the digital, mobile, social world, the attention fragmented world that we all live in today, expectations around engagement for storytelling also don't stand still. And let me take this to the New York Times to give you, which is obviously my employer, and what I believe is one of the great storytelling places left on earth, to give you a sense of what I mean by this. So this was an Olympics year. The Times always does quite a bit of coverage around the Olympics and has for the better part of our history. So I actually went back to the Olympics 10 years ago and I said, what were digitally some of the best read stories? And if everybody remembers the Olympics 10 years ago, the biggest story was that they took place in Athens, the birthplace of the Olympics. And this was one of the, we do hundreds and hundreds of pieces of Olympics coverage every Olympics. And this was one of the pieces that actually got the most page views. It was a story about being there at the birthplace of the Olympics. And we used kind of the best stuff we had at the time, which was largely words and a few pictures to describe what was going on. And that the sentence I pulled there that's a little hard to see is just the reporter talking about what it was like to walk down the streets of Athens and imagine the original Olympiads doing that. So camera on engagement pan to our coverage of the Olympics 10 years later. And just this past February, this is a very quick shot from a very long, very rich multimedia storytelling episode that we had around Ted Ligety, who is the giant slalom skier who I believe won the gold medal. And what that little piece of content from a much longer story just showed you quickly was how he is actually changing his sport by his skiing technique. And in fact, when Ted Ligety was interviewed after the Olympics in a room full of reporters as to why he won and why his technique was so different, he literally pointed to the New York Times reporter in the room who'd written that story and said, just ask him. He understands it better than I do. So the point here is what made the second story so much richer, we really believe, was the juxtaposition of both art and science in storytelling. And that's the era that we think we're all in today. And that's really what I'm here to talk about. And I'll suggest to you that for the New York Times, for the vast majority of our 163-year history, so I'm going to say for about 145 or so years of it, storytelling was mostly a thing of art, which really meant finding and articulating and depicting very, very important stories through words and through incredible images. And I pulled a story from a little more than a decade ago. Many of you will remember this incredible cover a year after 9/11 that in fact inspired Sunday Times Magazine cover, like kind of the best of storytelling is art, that in fact helped to inspire what became the 9/11 memorial. So that's how storytelling as art sort of worked for journalists. Storytelling as art for brands. I pulled an ad from the same issue right around that same time. Storytelling in ads was also really a thing largely driven by art. And then what happened with the advent of digital is we would say over the last 10, 20 years, the pendulum swung very, very hard over to storytelling as science. And on the publishing side of that equation, for a media company, you'll remember there was, many of you will remember this headline, so the New York Times bought About.com a little more than a decade ago. And there was a sense, the New York Times was never going to do all science for its storytelling, but there was a sense that a certain kind of stories could actually be told in more scientific ways. That was the basic premise of About.com. And then the real thing that happened that we would say, and this happened on the side of brands or marketers, the companies that you represent, that really swung the pendulum hard to science in our industry was this. Does everybody know what banner that is or whose banner that is? Does anyone know? So the first banner ad ever created was created for AT&T. I believe it's 20 years old this year. It had a 49% click-through rate. So it's all been dramatically downhill from there. What I would say about that banner is, and what I think we at the Times believe, banners are important, but what they essentially were an accidental invention by computer scientists with very little regard to art. I have a colleague who runs R&D and ad products at the Times who says efficiency took the poetry out of advertising with banners. And that notion was that the pendulum swung very hard to science, and the notion of how a brand could do storytelling in digital became almost artificially limited by the confines of a banner, and we saw click-through go from 49% to we all know where it is today. So what has kind of swung the pendulum back to the center? Because what I'm arguing is that in the juxtaposition of art and science, first we were at art, then we were at science, and now we're back in the center. And I would say it's two forces, social and mobile. Social brought the pendulum back to the center because essentially social gave all of your clients, gave everybody, brands, consumers, the same tools essentially that publishers had to tell their stories, which meant many, many more storytellers, much more competition for engagement, which you all live every day, for storytellers, and also, frankly, fast advancing and better storytelling tools. And what it also meant was that those tools are going to keep getting better, and that everyone who is a storyteller has to actually keep adopting new tools. What I mean by mobile bringing the pendulum back to the center is that mobile actually sort of broke open the boundaries of what storytelling could mean. Because before mobile, storytelling was something that you did in a particular time, in a particular place, in a particular way. And with mobile, that limitation sort of went away. Storytelling became an always-on thing that you could do everywhere, and very often with this device with which you have this incredibly intimate relationship with. So those are things, the notion of mobile and social bringing us back to the center, things we think about all the time at the Times. And I would say both social and mobile are the two biggest forces now affecting how we think about our own amplification of stories at the Times. So Times has tons and tons of social followers. My favorite factoid since I got there 9 months ago is that our stories are tweeted almost once every second. And the single most disruptive force we are facing as a storyteller who needs to monetize that storytelling through both consumers and advertising is the notion that today, half of all of our user sessions in digital are actually coming to us on a mobile device, which we think is a huge and material change, and one that is frankly going faster and arguably bigger and more important than the initial shift from print to digital. So my basic premise here is that expectations for engagement don't stand still, but what I would say is that in a world where art and science are now working together and in balance, neither does the New York Times or your brand's ability to actually meet those expectations. So when storytelling is the juxtaposition of both art and science, it almost knows no limits. So let me talk a little bit about what I mean by that. And the first thing that I mean by that is that I think that the juxtaposition of art and science means a whole new definition of narrative itself. So when storytelling was largely art, narrative was a thing that we did one to many, that essentially had a beginning, a middle, and an end that for the most part everybody experienced the same way. But in a scientific world, what I'm showing you here is an explanatory graphic that the New York Times did. I think we put it up in the Upshot just this weekend about NBA fans and basically where they are and where they live. And what this is showing you is a map of the whole country and essentially ordering by Facebook likes which teams have the most fans. And there are all sorts of surprising things there. Like you would imagine if you live in the center of the country, you might be an Oklahoma City Thunder fan, but in fact, there are more Lakers fans than there are Thunder or Grizzlies fans or Houston Rocket fans. My point about showing you this, and I just showed you a video of what is an interactive graphic, is the story path here, the notion of narrative, or how somebody experiences that, is a very personalized notion. So when stories are graphics layered on top of data sets, everybody can experience them very differently. Now, let me pause for a minute there on that notion of how storytelling goes from sort of a broad concept of one to many and kind of builds on something that also becomes one to one. I'll say that 2013 was a very good year for storytelling at the New York Times. It was our highest traffic year for stories, and we had a number of breakthroughs. And what I'm showing you here are 4 of the most read stories. So 4 stories that were in our top 10 most read stories, most viewed stories in digital on the New York Times in 2013. So bottom right, coverage of the Boston Marathon bombing, highest traffic month ever in the Times history. We still haven't met that again. Top left, most viewed video ever on the Times, Syrian rebels being executed by the Syrian government, and then 2 op-ed pieces by Vladimir Putin and Angelina Jolie. Those were 4 of the 10 best read stories in the New York Times. And they were stories that were arguably in that sort of one-to-many notion. So does anyone want to take a guess? None of these stories, celebrity, world leader, war, active terrorism in America, none of these stories was the most read story on the Times this year. Does anyone want to, or most viewed story? Anyone want to take a guess at what was? Any guesses? So when I show it to you, you'll know it. So it was actually this, how y'all use and you guys talk. So lots of recognition. Many of you took it. This was a, excuse me, a 25-question dialect quiz that was essentially built on a very, I loved it, no BuzzFeed listicle here. This is actually a very serious body of work. It was a quiz, 25 questions like, how would you agree, this is my favorite one, how would you address a group of 2 or more people? I'm from Richmond, Virginia, like the Martin Agency, so I would say y'all, but many people in the room would answer this very differently. Or what do you call the rubber-soled shoes worn in gym class for athletic activities? I would call those sneakers. You might call them something else. Anyway, the point of this is this was a highly personalized, explanatory, interactive that was based on a longitudinal Harvard linguistics study about origin and place and how people talk. So very important body of work, but expressed in this deeply personal way that made it all about you. And this was the single most viewed piece of content, not just in 2013, but to date in the history of the New York Times. So that is pretty extraordinary. There is a second extraordinary fact about this. Does anybody know what it is? It was, thank you, Natalie. It was written by an intern who, by the way, we have since hired, as you can imagine, and who built that NBA map that I showed you the video of, the NBA Interactive. he built that. So he's now full-time at the Times, but it's written by an intern. So I want to suggest that storytelling isn't just bound sort of by an old concept of narrative, but it is also unbound by voice. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that great storytelling can come from anywhere. So what you're looking at here is an article page on the New York Times. We relaunched our website in January. So this is a new article page on the New York Times. Across the top of that article page, you've got a headline ribbon that's giving you 4 other related stories. And the one that I've circled says, the headline, it's hard to read, will millennials ever shun the office completely? And it is a paid post or a native placement by none other than Dell, who have written an article on the New York Times, unambiguously labeled on the top, paid for and posted by Dell, unambiguously labeled in the headline ribbon, paid for and posted by Dell. But Dell is basically writing an awesome story from their point of expertise. And this is one of 12 stories that Dell wrote in the first quarter on the New York Times, or that New York Times, candidly, on our commercial side content studio, helped Dell produce, that were really relevant pieces of thought leadership that came from places of genuine expertise in Dell. And this story alone did about 20,000 page views, which compares very favorably to any New York Times text-based story. The story didn't just run on an article page, but is also made discoverable. So any paid post on the New York Times can be made discoverable on the homepage, middle of the homepage of the New York Times, which still gets 9 million impressions every day. So great content can come by anywhere, come from anywhere when we juxtapose art and science. And what I'm really talking about there is that art plus science means a very different relationship between brands and media companies. And that's at the heart of the relationships that we all have in this room. So what I'm showing you here is a collage from my very favorite feature on the NewYorkTimes.com. I always say this is great homework reading for anyone who cares about the frontier of storytelling. If you just go to the Times and type in Best Interactive Stories 2013, you'll get a collage that looks like this. And what we're using that collage to represent is the kinds of storytelling that we can actually help marketers do on the Times platform. And when we help marketers like Dell or Intel, Goldman Sachs or United or Reuters or any of the other companies that are doing their own storytelling on the Times platform in unambiguously labeled ways, what we're really doing is not just selling them audience and context, but we're actually sharing our storytelling tools and standards. And this is a really quick run through of a 5-chapter series we built for United around the Olympics coverage that I showed you earlier, where we actually helped them create an interactive graphic about how far all the athletes had to travel and how they actually packed up the plane with all the different kinds of equipment that go to the Olympics to go to Sochi, and how that's actually changed over time. And this package of content for United, all created by the business side content studio at the New York Times, including, I just showed you a thumbnail to a video with one of the Olympians, Sarah Hendrickson, who United sponsored. This package of content did close to 200,000 page views, which is vastly more than a typical editorial story would do. So just to give you a sense of great content can come from anywhere, and it can find an audience even if it's unambiguously labeled as coming from a brand. And I would say that actually stretches the relationships that marketers and publishers can have away from where we got when the pendulum swung too hard for science. Many of you in this room have probably seen this was the original Loom Escape that showed you all those people in the middle who were enabling the banner business. But when we are not just selling audience and context, and brands aren't just buying audience and context, but they're buying storytelling tools and know-how, we actually get closer together. We both realize more value from the other on the other side. So what have we learned in all this, and where do we go from here? I thought this morning you all are a room full of storytellers, so what is the Times thinking about at the frontier of storytelling? So 5 things that are on our minds. First one is that in the digital, mobile, social world that we live in, stories are conversations and readers are contributors. And I always say that's something a lot of people can say. I think it's amazing that even the New York Times, like the heralded New York Times, can say this. And what I'm showing you here is an incredible package of content that Libby Rosenthal, who's one of our award-winning reporters, has been working on over the last couple of years about the cost of healthcare in the United States. And what's amazing about this piece, Libby started with a story on the cost of a colonoscopy all over the country, and she actually sourced all of the material within the story itself by asking readers questions like, what is the impact of medical costs on your family? Did the doctor give you an estimate of the price before you had the procedure? How should the government be involved? And somewhere close to 20,000 people got involved with that story, and that story became a very substantial multi-part series on the cost of healthcare. So stories are conversations and readers are contributors. Secondly, personal context is everything. You got that with the dialect quiz. What I'm showing you here is how does the Times take a big topic like the debate on the minimum wage and actually make that really matter to people. One of the best viewed things we did earlier this year was a little quiz, can you live on the minimum wage? That had tremendous feedback, and the feedback was all around, you made me think of the minimum wage differently and the debate differently when I myself actually plugged in what my standard of living would be based on that. Third lesson, mobile-centric content design is a must. Let me say this one in the context of the disruption in our business. By the way, what I'm showing you here is just the first 4 frames of an incredible little story that we did. You should look at it after, called The Extra Virgin Suicides, which was essentially about crime and malfeasance in the Italian olive oil business. The thesis is the olive oil, the extra virgin olive oil that you're paying $15 a bottle from at Walmart is 99% car oil. So you should probably be paying $1 for it. But we told this story in an incredibly visual infographic that was self-propelled swiping, really designed for mobile, but obviously ran on the web and in other places, and one of the best read stories we've done. So I go back to one of my original points, which is that, and I'll show that one more time because I think it's such a cool thing to see. My original point is 50% of our users are now coming to us from a mobile device. So as you think about your brands telling stories, what we think you should be thinking about is how do I do that in ways that are really meant for that, responsive to that device. And in mobile, we would say we know what works is self-propelled tappability or swipeability, and we are getting ready to launch an ad product, a paid post product that will follow this model as well. That'll happen in the next month or so. The other lesson, 4th lesson we've learned so far is getting to the atomic unit of content. How we actually atomize that content really matters. And I think there's a whole interesting body of work here for publishers and for brands. And what I would say is the Times does great, probably better than anybody else, kind of in the moment reporting on content. And I think, this is a great example of when the embassy was attacked in Benghazi, of our coverage of that. We think brands have a particular role to play in sort of in-the-moment coverage, and that is associating themselves with topics that matter. Intel did this really well in a paid post on our site during CES, not reporting from CES, but writing their own expert perspective tied to the news on the future of wearables. So that's how the Times does content in the moment, how a marketer might. Other thing that the Times does incredibly well is retrospective content. So a year after Benghazi, after all that coverage, we did what I would now say is a sort of evergreen piece, a more thoughtful piece about what did we think really happened in Benghazi. We think brands are never going to be reporting, right? The notion of kind of brand journalism is maybe a little miscast, but brands are storytellers, and they're going to tell stories that are sort of tied to what's happening in the news. And here we would say there are a lot of brands that have their own evergreen topics that they can build more thoughtful pieces around. What we all really have to get great at, because I think the first 2 things we've all been pretty decent at so far, is atomizing for forward-looking content. The Times just launched about 6 weeks ago a new product called NYT Now, essentially a mobile app that's saying these are the stories you should be watching, these are the stories we're watching. I'm showing you a first screen there of stories being updated all day long. So you see upheaval in Ukraine as an update, and then our picks of the other stories we're launching around the web. And as you think about your brands creating content, being a part of that sort of forward-looking flow, we believe matters. And then lastly, we would say, in the lessons that we've learned so far, and this one is specifically for brands, newsroom metrics are really today's standard. So I talked about that 49% click-through rate on the AT&T banner. That's now down to probably 0.01%, right? So we would like to live in a world where we get beyond that. We all know that's not what, brands, when 99.9% of something is a failure, none of us can call that a success. But what we do think is a success is brands creating real and meaningful engagement for their content. So what we're showing you here is a dashboard that we've built with a company called Simple Reach that all of our paid post partners have that tells them, it's a little bit hard to see, but how many total page views they've gotten. So this is Dell, just under 20,000. How many social referrals they've gotten and how much social sharing they've gotten for each story they produce, as well as, and this is just a snapshot of who is tweeting that story and how do we rank the path of those tweets by cloud score. And I could go on and show you a lot more here to show you things like scroll depth and scroll velocity and how are people actually engaging with piece of content. So we would say we are all moving toward a world where what the New York Times newsroom cares about and what a brand cares about in terms of how people engage with a piece of content is actually going to look much more close together versus Times caring about how many people view and share the content and a brand caring about a click-through. So I think the real question then becomes, what is the Times seeing so far? What is, I think, generally the world seeing so far on how brand storytelling in the context of a premium publisher's storytelling really does engage readers or not? And I'll tell you, we launched our Marketer as Storyteller platform in January. We have, I think, 8 partners live now, half a dozen more on the way that'll come in the next few months. And what we've seen so far is that time spent, the name for our product is paid posts, because again, at the Times, it's utterly important that it's always, we're not trying to do mimicry or trickery here, not trying to convince a reader that a marketer's story is actually coming from our newsroom. We tell them up front that it's not. But the time spent on paid posts so far, on average, is roughly equivalent to, or in some cases, exceeds time spent on editorial pages. So for example, the interactives we've done, like the United piece, would exceed that of a typical editorial story, and we mean broadly, not just at the Times. Secondly, and this is my favorite, so far we've created almost 6,000 hours of engagement with marketer stories. This is amazing. A third of the traffic for our paid posts is actually coming from social, meaning people referring back to it because they actually liked the piece of content, and earned media is quite strong. So we tell our marketers, you should think about what you've spent with us, and did you get at least that much back, or 2 or 3x that in terms of the media exposure that you've earned. So far we would say the notion of brands being able to tell stories with support from the premium publishers, commercial side, content studio in that environment is working very well. We have a note of caution here, which is to say, let's not sort of take this so far that we let page views become the new clicks. This was one of my favorite stories that came out this year, where basically The Verge said page views, how many page views do you get for people not actually seeing the content? So we are focused on lots of other metrics beyond just views to depth of engagement. And ultimately, what you and the Times and everybody else is focused on is, can we really influence the conversation? Of all the stories the Times did last year, probably the most talked about, one of the most talked about was this incredible 28,000 word package we did on homelessness called Invisible Child. Not really measured by views so much as how much it influenced the conversation in New York City. And ultimately, that's the work for brands. How do you add value to the conversation? How do you really create stories that engage, that entertain, and that inform? My last and favorite example of this is through paid posts. Our first interactive graphic was an incredible multi-chapter explanatory graphic that we built for Goldman Sachs on the capital markets that did just as well as that United program did. So it's been an extraordinary success. And that was all inspired by the way we do our interactive graphics in the newsroom. And I will end by saying, I started on expectations for engagement, don't stand still. But ultimately, where did I end up with a birthday party? Matt from Party City on the NBA, cupcakes, and a few friends in my apartment. expectations for engagement don't stand still, but the basic human need does. And my son's basic human need was to be celebrated, and the basic human need on storytelling is to be engaged, is for something actually worth stopping for. So I will stop there and see if I can answer any questions.